After leaving the mountain, Jesus and his disciples went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, Jesus asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Just around this time of the year, always in the middle of September, and around the 14th and 15th, the church for ancient times has always celebrated the feast of the exaltation of the cross. And the readings often speak of the same reality as Jesus does in the gospel today. But they become very frequent also in Mark's gospel because we've been reading it consecutively all through this year. We're getting near the end of it, and Jesus is beginning to teach his disciples of the real kernel of the truth of the mystery of his entire life, of his incarnation on earth. And he does this in a very beautiful way, but he does it in a way in which he knows his disciples will understand and how long it will take for them to understand. And so earlier in this chapter that we're reading from the 9th chapter, Jesus has taken his select few, 3 disciples up on the mountain of transfiguration, and has revealed his glory, part of his glory to them, which we've reflected upon as well, and speaks to them on the way down of the mystery of his suffering and of his death and his rising from the dead. And they talk among themselves, what could this rising of the dead mean? And we speak of this during Lent because always in the second Sunday of Lent we have a reading of the Transfiguration to speak of the glory of the Lord. But it also leaves that question for us, what does it mean to rise from the dead? And the disciples ponder that as they come down the mountain. Here now Jesus is going through Galilee. It's approaching the end of the gospel, and so he's getting to a point where he's starting to speak more clearly of this mystery, which is going to be difficult for the disciples to understand. And he speaks to them just bluntly. And he speaks to them about the mystery of his suffering and of his death and of his rising from the dead. And as they continue on in their pilgrimage, and there's a movement here which is just nice to see, just like our lives, of the pilgrimage of our own lives, no one asks them any questions because they're afraid to. And it's just good for us to reflect upon what's going on in the disciples' hearts, that they don't have the liberty to ask Jesus what he means, because he's already taken aside only select few of the apostles or disciples to speak of this mystery to them. These are the select few that are around him, and he knows that he needs to speak to them first so that they will become the servants of his mission after his death and his resurrection. And they don't have the freedom to ask, as we saw so many places other than the gospel, where a disciple asks something, and it's almost as if Jesus is rebuking them for a stupid question. But I don't think that's the sense of how Jesus responds at all. Here, they're afraid to ask any questions. And we find out why as the gospel proceeds, because they have lost their liberty because they've been fighting among themselves to see who's the greatest. Jesus, who understands this, calls a halt to the pilgrimage right away and says, "Come on, everybody, and sit down. If we continue like this, we'll end up in last place, or we'll go bankrupt, or whatever." And like every organization, when it gets off the rails, as it's gone off the rails here with the disciples, Jesus calls a halt to everything and sits them down and teaches them forcefully that there's something here that they need to address, or this is going to be a disaster. And it's given to us because it's endemic to the human condition for all of us. And it's given to us with that sobriety also, to see that this in some ways is the tragic flaw of being a disciple, of losing sight of Christ speaking of a mystery that unites us all together as we listen to him, and forgetting about that and disputing among oneself about whatever it is that puts one above the other, or gives one precedence, or gives one importance, or just gives self-esteem to whoever. And we don't really need to know how they fought among themselves about who is the greatest, because it probably takes so many different complexions and flavors of everything that we do in our lives, and it's so, as I said, endemic to the human condition, that it's something that is expressing itself in so many different ways. This is a wonderful reading to use before we go to confession as an examination of our conscience, because there would be very few people who don't have this kind of thing constantly pushing them in their lives, because of the fact that we're social beings and we spend probably all of our time with other people. It's just the nature of our condition and what we do. How we react to it, Christ says, if you react like this, this is going to be a disaster. And so remember this teaching, and he makes it forcefully to them, and he gives the example of a simple, humble child. Unless you act like this child and are willing to serve from the last place, this will not click for you. You will not understand the mystery of what this Son of God is doing in your midst right now. There are many religious communities throughout the world that have been existing from the earliest times of Christianity itself, including the first Christian community that existed in Jerusalem after the resurrection. And I was speaking to one of the superiors of one of the religious communities, and they make promises, as we know, often to celibacy and obedience, and to poverty and other things that mark the charisms of their religious life, which are so important for the life of the church. And they live in common together. But without doubt, as they all express, the biggest challenge is to live with the brothers or the sisters in charity. And this superior of the community has a sense of what's going on within the community, that he knows, or they know, that something's amiss. People are starting to murmur, people are starting to complain, and something has been lost. And he speaks to them and says, okay, it's time for everybody to go to confession, because there's a spirit here that is just akin to what we see in the gospel of losing sight of the wonderful mystery Christ is speaking to his apostles and disciples and speaking to us. And they're beginning to murmur and complain and losing sight of the pilgrimage itself. And it's a wonderful insight and discernment to say that this is something that happens frequently in human life, and something that needs constant vigilance and constant combating, because of the fact that we live with one another so frequently, and we fall so easily into this sense of criticizing others, often just to get ourselves ahead. But the servant who becomes a disciple and is a servant of the suffering and the death and the cross of Christ and of the resurrection comes from the last place to serve all, with a humility that is the humility of Christ, who humbles himself for us. And this becomes an enormous task, an enormous challenge for the Christian and for the Catholic, because it's something that is always there for us. But when we hold in our hearts the beauty of Christ's example and of his great saints, the Blessed Mother, we see the fruits that take place when we serve from the last, when we're vigilant every day to making sure that we're not murmuring and gossiping and criticizing other people. And it's something that can take place when there is no vigilance and no controls in the world, and it's something that can take place when there's no vigilance and no care in the church itself. And this is a constant area of concern that the Holy Father has expressed to us again and again. The evils of gossip and the evils of criticism within the community, and of losing sight of the mystery of Christ's cross and resurrection for all of us. This is something that is part of our lives. It should be sobering for us as well. And it's good for us once in a while to have the Lord take us aside and really give a sobering talk to us to say, this is not how disciples act. And it's good for us to do that in our quiet and our preparation, our conscience, and let the Lord and the Holy Spirit say those things to us with a sternness, but founded on a deep love, because unless you do these things, you will miss the essence of the mystery of what he has come to preach to us about. Making ourselves humble like Christ so that we can accept and live the mystery of his cross and resurrection, which is so akin for our lives.